All right, folks, happy Monday. This is Mr. Miller coming at you here. It's Monday, the 30th of March. This happens to be my 1/4 birthday on the 30th of March. So now I am 28 and a quarter, which is exciting, to say the least. I don't really celebrate it that much, but I at least mention it. So that's what I'll do there, just mention it. So this is for Regents U.S. history. We are going to continue on with some notes today. Hopefully on Friday you were able to catch up on some things. Again, this information kind of just keeps coming at you, and we're going to keep moving forward. So it's important that you take the time every day. We're definitely catching up whatever you've missed over the weekend or Friday or Saturday, because the information will keep coming and we'll just keep moving forward. So that's kind of what we're trying to do and expected to do. So just make sure that you're, again, keep on top of this stuff. And if you don't stay on top of it, it's going to be hard to catch back up because there's new stuff every day. So just like you would be in school, just take some time every day if you can find the time. Hopefully you can, and devote a few minutes to this. So, and I guess to the rest of your classes too, because this is not necessarily the only thing that you've got going on, and I understand that. But just make sure that you've got you're staying on the ball and taking responsibility for what's going on here. So where we are going to go today is getting into more of the meat of the Second World War. We had talked about on Thursday how America gets roped into this. Japan ends up attacking us. We are viewed as a threat to the Axis powers. We are viewed as somebody who's going to help out the Allies and who has been helping out the Allies. So Japan launches an attack on us in order to try to damage our Navy at Pearl Harbor. They damaged our Navy for sure, but it was not as damaging as it could have been. Again, we didn't have any aircraft carriers there. We rebounded pretty quickly from this, and it kind of brought us into the war for I guess all intents and purposes. So we get brought into this war. Where we had left off on Thursday was a discussion about kind of this early war in the Pacific and how Japan has continued to kind of expand into the Pacific, and our job is to start to back them off, back them up into back into Japan. So this ends up taking about 3.5 years to get Japan back to Japan, essentially. About 3 years until we're fighting in Japan, actually. But we have to kind of go through each one of these islands, and we'll talk about that today a little bit more. Important thing to note before we get into our next slide here, which is Europe, fighting in Europe. We are kind of left on our own in terms of Japan in the Pacific. America does pretty much all of the fighting in the Pacific. Russia, to my knowledge, didn't help a ton. They might have been planning on it, but didn't. So we are kind of left on our own here. We're fighting kind of a two-front war. We end up fighting in the Pacific as well as in Europe and Africa kind of as well, which we'll talk about today. So the focus ends up kind of starting on, let me go ahead and move on to number 11 here. The focus for the Allies. The Allies, again, we're talking about those three countries. I guess we got 4 countries there, but 3 main countries, America, England, Russia, or the Soviet Union at this point, and then also France can be included in that, but France has lost their territory at this point, and they're kind of just helping us fight. So France, England, America, and the Soviet Union. We end up advocating for kind of, I don't know, we're kind of worried in some ways. Specifically America as well as England. Okay, so I've got pictured here what we would call the quote-unquote big 3. Okay, I had to get my air quotes in there. The big three, we call them. Okay, here we've got Joseph Stalin pictured on the far left there. We have FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president, in the middle there. And then this guy over here is the British Prime Minister. His name is Winston Churchill, who you guys know from last year. So you guys know about all of these people. But specifically, we view our relationship with England in the United States as a much tighter relationship than either of those two countries and the Soviet Union. We are much closer friends with England than we are with the Soviets. So we get a little worried about the Soviets. Okay, Joseph Stalin is, if you know about world history, not a great guy in terms of our American perspective, because he killed millions of people, led the Soviet Union in their, I guess, aggressive communism. So we've got not a great feeling about Joseph Stalin over the course of our time. So we're a little worried about Joseph Stalin. We are worried about what Joseph Stalin will do if we end up working with him to fight this war and hopefully win this war. What is he going to do after we win? Or what is he going to do if we lose? That's kind of a question. We're not really sure if we trust him or not. Again, Joseph Stalin was a guy who signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, so saying that they weren't going to attack either of Germany or the Soviet Union, so they weren't going to be attacking each other. Germany ended up breaking that, but eventually that happens. But Joseph Stalin originally, he's not really looking to help out a ton. So we've got to kind of think about him a little bit cautiously here. So we work hard, though. The big three pictured here work very hard throughout the war to try to keep the relationship manageable. They view, and this kind of gets into the strategy here, the big three, or the Allies, end up viewing Germany as the strongest of the Axis powers. Okay, and it's probably true. Okay, Italy kind of did what Germany did, but Italy was definitely weaker than Germany was. And Japan was kind of out on their own in the Pacific, but also Japan wasn't viewed as big of a threat as Germany was. So we view Germany as the biggest, strongest power. And what do you do if you are trying to win a war against three people? You take out the strongest one first. That's ultimately what we tried to do. Okay, it's no different than sporting events. You try to disable, or not disable, but you try to neutralize the biggest threat. If that's a person in basketball, you put your best defender on that person, so then they can't score, and then everybody else is okay to deal with, but not that one person. So that's kind of what we have here. Everybody goes for Germany, and we're going to focus on Germany. We're going to focus on Asia later. America specifically, though, we can't afford to wait around on Asia. So we get kind of the green light to go ahead and keep fighting in Asia. And so we're fighting the Japanese all the way through this war, starting 1942 and going onward. So we're fighting all the way through in both spots. But the rest of the Allies, they are only focused on Germany at this point. But again, we cannot afford to only stay focused on Germany. We kind of need to branch out a little bit and focus on Japan too. Otherwise, we're going to get attacked like we did already. FDR had this great plan, and he's got a famous quote here that I've got up here. He wanted to turn America into what he called the arsenal of democracy, meaning, and this is kind of building into where we were in Lend-Lease Act and those different acts that were allowing for us to contribute to the war effort, although not being in the war. At this point, we want to be this country that is going to provide for people who are fighting back, provide for people who are fighting for democracy. So we want to be the arsenal of democracy. An arsenal is a place where you store the weapons. Okay, you store all of those products that you would use in war. So we want to be the storehouse. We want to be the provider of these weapons. So then we can obviously provide and make it so that we can win this war. So we want to become the arsenal of democracy is kind of the saying there. Now, moving into number 12. okay, into number 12. American fighting in Europe and Africa. The Germans and Italians had spread into Africa, northern Africa. I don't think I have a good map here. No, I do. Okay. So I've got a map here. So down in Libya, in Egypt, way down at the bottom of this map, you can see we've got Axis-controlled areas in 1942. So America, we say, okay, we've got to start squeezing these Axis powers back into their box. So we end up trying to advocate for an invasion of Africa first. So we end up starting out in Africa. We start in Egypt and push them through Libya, as is pictured down there at the bottom. You can see that blue line. That's an Allied advance in 1942. So that's one of the first spots that we go. We're not in Europe at this point, at the very beginning. But by 1943, we have pushed the Germans and Italians out of Africa. So now we've got them in kind of in a smaller box in Europe, and now we need to start kind of cracking down there. Now, a couple guys to mention are pictured right here. So I've got them both written on my screen here, or on my board behind me. I'll show you that in a second. So both of these guys are strong U.S. generals. They both have very high leadership roles. One of them becomes president later on. So we have these two guys. The guy that was pictured on the right, or on the left, I guess, in the middle of the screen. The guy sitting there riding that Jeep. That is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay, Dwight D. Eisenhower. You can pause the video if you need to write that down. The second guy pictured there is George S. Patton. Okay, so these two guys are kind of our best generals at the time in terms of fighting in Europe. There were other main generals that were out in the Pacific, which we'll talk about those guys. But specifically, Dwight D. Eisenhower, George Patton, those are the two guys in Europe who are fighting and leading the fighting here going forward. Now we end up, let me go ahead and move on to this map here. We end up invading into Italy. Italy ends up falling. We get Italy to fall by the end of 1943. Okay, so we have invaded Italy. We finally invade Italy in the first couple months of 1943, and within 6 months, by September, it ends up falling, and so Italy surrenders. Now, Italy did not, I guess, completely surrender because Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, ended up running away, fleeing up to the northern area of Italy. And so he ended up kind of creating a kind of a fake Italy to keep power. So he was still kind of around, and we didn't kick him out of power, but he ran away and fled. And so got to northern Italy and kept that under Axis control. But we have kind of opened up Italy. So we are making pretty good progress here in 1943 into Europe. So let's go ahead and move on to number 13. Okay, so 13. 13. There are a couple famous battles that we got to talk about in number 13. I actually want to go back to this map here. Okay, you can't see it great, but you can at least see kind of that Japan in the Pacific has really expanded outwards. Okay, we've got all this territory out here that Japan is kind of controlling, and this is their greatest Japanese advance in 1942, as it says on this map here. So we have Japan who is expanding, and we need to start to kind of rein them in a little bit and squeeze them back into their box. So there is one, I guess our first major battle that we got to talk about is written down here, called the Battle of Midway, down on the bottom there of the screen. So the Battle of Midway, interestingly enough, this was in June of 1942. Okay, June of 1942. This is very soon after America starts in this fighting. This was really one of the first battles that we had fought in the Pacific. And what ends up happening is this turns out to be the turning point of the Pacific, the fighting in the Pacific. This is the turning point. And it was only 6 months after Pearl Harbor happened. But what you need to know about a turning point is it is a time when if you have a, let me get my hand here so I can illustrate this. You have the war going one way, okay, and then it turns and it goes the other way. So if you think about it, this Battle of Midway is a turning point because it is the point where the Japanese control starts shrinking. Okay, this is the point where we have stopped the Japanese in their tracks, and the Japanese can go no further, and we start taking over land from them after this battle. So this battle takes place in 1942, like I said, in June. America ends up winning, obviously, since it's our turning point in the war. We end up having a bunch of aircraft carriers that are engaged at this battle. Japan, we ended up sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and we only lost 1 aircraft carrier. On these Japanese aircraft carriers, there were over 250 planes, 250 airplanes on them that could have been used as kamikaze planes, but also as just general support planes or bombers, whatever. So we end up really crippling the Japanese Navy at this point at the Battle of Midway. So this turns out to be, like I said, the turning point, because after this battle, America becomes kind of America kind of goes on the offense. So let me show you here. I'll show you on the map where Midway is. So here's Hawaii. If you're looking at the map, if you can see my mouse all the way over on the right-hand side of the screen. Midway is just next door. So here's the Battle of Midway, just outside of the Japanese control. They were expanding out to the east, and so we end up kind of stopping them in their tracks at Midway and then jumping to a bunch of new places. So we will get into that in a second here, what that's all about. Before we do that, there's another battle that we got to talk about, and it is written up here in blue. It is called Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal happens to be a place. It's very famous for the Marines. The Marines had very valiant fighting at Guadalcanal. This was in August of 1942, and so Guadalcanal was American victory. You can look up a lot more details on either of these 2 battles if you wanted to, if you're interested in land or naval battles, but also Guadalcanal is kind of an island battle. Guadalcanal, for a point of reference, is way down here at the bottom of the screen. You might be able to see that. It says Guadalcanal Island, and so that's 1942. So what ends up happening here is a process that kind of takes the next 3 years to finish. And it is here in black on my board. It's called island hopping. Okay, island hopping. Island hopping is this idea that really, you know, we're jumping from island to island. Okay, you can see here, if we're looking at this map, you can see here, let me just expand this so it's a little bit, I can't make it any bigger. Let me just show it to you completely. So you're not seeing my face right now, but you can see this map, so it's a little bigger. You can see that there are, and my mouse is down here at the bottom of the screen, you can see that there's these tracks that America kind of follows. America is all these blue lines here, and we're jumping from island to island to island to island to island to island, and finishing up by ultimately getting to Japan. And that's kind of our idea. We need to go island to island, pushing the Japanese off of their territories. So that is kind of the goal here. Let me go back to the screen split. So that is kind of the goal here. We're trying to push the Japanese back into their boxes, back into their areas. So that's kind of what we got. So let me go back to American fighting in the Pacific. So both of these pictures are here. This one picture on the left, I believe, is from Guadalcanal. The other one is from the Battle of Midway, which was mostly a sea battle. And here's kind of another map. Here's a picture of Guadalcanal. And so here's another map kind of showing this island hopping that's going on here as we're going from spot to spot to spot, jumping along and hopping from island to island. So that's what I got there for number 13. Now we'll go through number 14, then we'll be done for the day. We're not getting through as much as I had hoped, but I'm trying to keep it shorter so then it's manageable, combined with the essential questions at the end. So we might have to go through things a little slower, but we will make do. Now, number 14 is the war effort at home. Okay, there were a lot of ways that Americans were asked to contribute to the war effort, even if they are not in the war. We said the other day that there were 16 million Americans who serve in the war, mostly men, some women who were in the Women's Army Corps, but mostly men. When all these people are away, we have this Homefront effort. Okay, the Homefront is kind of what we give the nickname to the fighting that happens at home. It is not literal fighting. It is not fighting that takes place with guns and ships and tanks and airplanes and that. But it is still a place where the war is fought. We fight the war every single day when we are advocating for rationing or gardens or things like that, and we'll talk about all those things. But this is a way for normal Americans to contribute to the war effort. So let's start out with what I've got pictured. I guess I've got written down here. In red, I have war bonds. Okay, war bonds were a way for America to get money, for the government to get money in this war effort. So what America would do is the government would say, okay, anybody want to take out a bond or a savings bond? They would get a little bit of money later on, or a lot of money later on. The government would pay them back with interest, and it was a good way to invest your money. So the government gets people to contribute money to the war effort, and they can use it when they need to use it, and they'll pay it back later. And people get to feel like, hey, I'm helping. I'm doing my part. I'm contributing to the war effort here. I am giving my money to the government for them to use for the time being. So war bonds were a good way for a lot of Americans to get involved. Now, let's talk about products, okay? America had a lot of need for a lot of new products that normal Americans would generally use. So we enter into a period of what we would call rationing. Okay, so it's there in green on the board. So we call it rationing. Rationing, you guys know hopefully what rationing is. It just means limiting your intake. For example, today, if somebody was to go to like a grocery store and try to get a loaf of bread, they might say you can only have 1 loaf of bread or 2 loaves of bread or 1 gallon of milk. Because they're trying to save some for everybody else in this coronavirus time. So that's like a real life sort of rationing that happens. At this point, and this is a picture from England, a Ministry of Food, I believe it's from England. But what would happen here is you would have people who would get ration books. Each family would get a book, and it would have a certain number of stamps in it, where if you wanted to go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk, you would have to rip out the little ticket that said 1 gallon of milk, and you would pay for it. It wasn't a free gallon of milk by having the ticket, but you would pay for it, but then you would have to give up your ticket. And you would only get a certain number of tickets every month or every 3 months. And that way they would say that they're rationing. It was a way to limit what Americans were using. So ration books were a popular way for families to have their products limited. They would limit people's oil, fuel, rubber, any products that you might think the military might need beyond food. They need a lot of stuff. There's millions of Americans who are fighting this war in other places, and we need to support them. So most people were happy to do their part and cut back a little bit and not overuse products. So ration books are kind of a common thing at this point. Now, last thing that we got to mention here, and then we'll cut it away for the day, is a victory garden, and I have that written here on the board at the bottom in blue. So victory gardens. Victory gardens are a way for, again, normal Americans to feel like they are contributing to the war effort. A victory garden, and this is an example of this poster here. It would be an example of propaganda trying to advocate and get people to purchase, or I guess plant victory gardens. It says War Gardens for Victory, grow vitamins at your kitchen door. If you have millions of Americans who are planting their own gardens, that is millions of Americans who do not need to shop for vegetables at the grocery store. And all of that production of vegetables can go straight to the military. So it's just a way for Americans to save on rationing and grow their own food if they're able, if they're in a spot where they can grow their own food. But growing their own food so then they can allow for the American troops to have more of their own stuff. So I think that's all I have for this number 14. Yep. Okay. So we'll get into Japanese internment tomorrow, which happens to be kind of a bit of a dark spot in the war effort here. But at this point, we're good to go on to those essential questions. So I'm yet to write them up. I think there's going to be 2 essential questions. There might be 3, but 2 or 3 essential questions. I'll type them up right after this. So go ahead and answer those. Again, answer those few complete sentences for each, and then you'll be done. Make sure you submit. I had a couple people ask me questions. Why are they coming to me? Put in your email address, and that's a way for me to make sure that I know who's coming from who, whose answers are coming from who. It just records, and I set it up to say that it'll send you a copy of your responses. So don't be alarmed. If it sends you a copy of your responses, it means you did everything right. So that is all that you really need to do with that. So I think that's all I have for you. We are, again, at day number 14 here of the coronavirus outbreak. So this is 2 weeks. Hopefully everybody's safe and healthy and continuing on with their social distancing and doing their part to stop the spread of this virus. So take care. Hope you and your families are well. And we will see you guys back here tomorrow. So go on and work on those essential questions, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Take care.